Well, good evening and welcome to our Literary Cafe. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. The Literary Cafe was created by the foundation, and the library is pleased to collaborate with the foundation and Marjan Kamali on this series. I would also like to thank the Acton Memorial Library and the Tewksbury Public Library for partnering with us on this program. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please submit your questions to the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our host. Marjan Kamali is the author of the national bestseller, The Stationery Shop, which is being adapted into an HBO series, and Together Tea, which was a Massachusetts Book Award finalist. Her novels have been translated in over 20 languages. Born in Turkey to Iranian parents, Kamali spent her childhood in Turkey, Iran, Germany, Kenya, and the US. She holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley, an MBA from Columbia University, and a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from New York University. She is a 2022 recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship. She currently teaches creative writing at Grub Street and lives in the Boston area with her family. Please join me in welcoming Marjan, who is going to introduce our guests this evening.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the Cary Memorial Library and the Cary Memorial Library Foundation for making our Literary Cafe possible. I'm so excited tonight to talk to two incredible writers who've written memoirs that are very different, but that are just so well written, draw you in, keep you turning the page. And I know so many students are tuning in tonight wanting to learn how they too can turn their memories into a memoir. So we're going to have a wonderful discussion about how exactly to do that and how to find that core truth in your experience to portray within the books. So I can't wait to dive in, but I will first give you all just a little overview of how the night's going to go. I'm going to introduce our wonderful writers. We will hear from each one of them. They will give you a flavor of their memoirs. And then the three of us will have a discussion where I luckily get to ask all the questions I have about how they made their memoirs work so well. And then we will leave some space at the end for Q&A. So we will wrap everything up by 8:30, and then you can have your ice cream and go to bed if you're like me, or stay up if you wish. But first, let me introduce you our two writers. So we have Neema Avashia and E.B.Bartels. Neema Avashia is the daughter of Indian immigrants and was born and raised in southern West Virginia. She has been an educator and activist in the Boston Public Schools since 2003 and was named a City of Boston Educator of the Year in 2013. Her first book, Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, was published by West Virginia University Press in March 2022. It has been called a timely collection that begins to fill the gap in literature focused mainly on the white male experience by Ms. Magazine, and a graceful exploration of identity, community, and contradictions by Scalawag. The book was named Best LGBTQ Memoir of 2022 by Book Riot, was one of New York Public Library's best books of 2022, and was a finalist for the New England Book Award, the Weatherford Award, and a Lambda Literary Award. She lives in Boston with her partner Laura and her daughter Kahani. E.B.Bartels is a nonfiction writer, a former Newtonville Books bookseller, and a Grub Street instructor with an MFA from Columbia University. Her writing has appeared in Slate, Salon, Literary Hub, WBUR, Catapult, Electric Literature, The Believer, and The Rumpus, among others. She is the author of Good Grief, Unloving Pets, Here and Hereafter, a narrative nonfiction book about the world of loving and losing animals, exploring the singular nature of our bonds with our companion animals and how best to grieve for them once they've passed away. E.B. grew up in Lexington, going to the Cary Memorial Library every week with her mom, and she now lives in Arlington with her husband, Richie, and their many, many pets. So I hope you join me in welcoming our two wonderful authors tonight. And I thought we would start by having each one give you a little bit of a background about what their memoir is about and give you a flavor of the memoir by reading a short passage. So I'm just going to go in alphabetical order, and Neema, I will hand the mic to you.
Sure. Thank you, Marjan. It's so lovely to be here with you and EB, and thanks to the folks at the Cary Library for making this possible. My book, Another Appalachia, is about the experience of growing up in Southern West Virginia to immigrant parents as a pretty intensely minoritized community. There were only about 100 Indian families in the Kanawha Valley in West Virginia where I grew up. I was often the only student of color in my classes, but also having this really vibrant and thriving community of aunties and uncles and might as well be siblings who made my weekends really rich and culturally affirming. And so I had both this experience of being very minoritized and also this experience of being very affirmed that happened kind of at the same time. And so the essays kind of explore both the experience of that growing up and also how that growing up has kind of continued to resonate for me over the course of my life. So I'm going to read you just a very short passage from an essay that's called 9 Forms of the Goddess. And the reason why I'm choosing to read this is because it is actually about the Hindu festival of Navratri, which is right now, which is the harvest festival. It lasts for 9 nights. And this essay, each of the 9 nights is honors a different goddess. And this essay takes 9 women from my life and kind of considers them as goddesses and sort of talks about sort of the role they played for me. So I'm just going to read you the beginning of that essay. 9 Forms of the Goddess. It is 1982, and 9 Indian women have gathered in a circle in a basement in Cross Lanes, West Virginia, to celebrate the festival of Navratri. The basement floor is covered with bright blue indoor-outdoor carpet. The walls are lined with honey brown faux wood paneling, and there's a red metal beam in the center of the room where a lighted brass pot called a garbo and idols of deities should typically stand. In sharp contrast to their damp surroundings, these women dress in their heaviest silk saris and best jewelry. Finery brought with them in suitcases that traveled 8,000 miles from India to New York, sometimes by way of Kenya or Uganda or England, and then another 500 miles from Jamaica, Queens to the hills of West Virginia. The women gather for as many of 9 nights as they can spare each autumn. In Gujarati, Nav means 9 and Rat means night. Each night, a different color inspires their clothing. Each night, a different incarnation of the goddess Durga is the focus of their worship. Durga, queen among Hindu goddesses, warrior for good, vanquisher of evil. She is often depicted astride a tiger, holding a sword, a trident, a mace, and a dagger in her many arms. Durga literally means unassailable, the mother goddess who will not be challenged or questioned in her battle to preserve the dharma of the righteous. These worshippers of Durga begin each night the same way, singing the Mataji Nagarba in voices that are pitched and clear. With their words, they praise the many forms and powers of the mother goddess. They slowly clap and slide around the circle, their motions repetitive and rhythmic. They pick up speed. The 2 clap gives way to a 3 clap. Their bodies begin to blur, faces lost in a whirl of spinning, shining colors. The smell of sweat, mixing with that of perfume and powder, fills the room. In the morning, tiny purple bruises will dot their arms, elicited by the repeated banging of their glass bangles. The soles of their feet will bear the red marks of carpet burn. Their waists will host near-permanent indentations from the tightness of their petticoats. But for these 9 nights, there is no pain insufferable enough to make them leave the circle early. 9 women gather, 9 nights, 9 colors, 9 forms of the mother goddess spinning in front of me. 39 years later, I live in Boston and have no Indian community to speak of. There are weekend Navratri Garbas in the suburbs, massive gatherings of Indians I do not know in the gymnasiums of middle schools I've never heard of. I feel no pull to go to these anonymous celebrations, where ritual feels meaningless in the absence of relationships. Instead, the sharpest pang is the one asking me to go backwards in time, back to the tiny Indian community nestled in the Kanawha Valley, back to the basement in Cross Lanes, back to the Garba where the faces in the circle are the faces of my many mothers, and their characters are the unassailable personifications of Navdurga. Though I was just 3 at the time, when I envisioned the Cross Lanes Garba, I see myself as I look now, and my mothers are all my age. I take the pace of Shaila Putri, worshipped on the first day of Navratri. Like her, I too am a daughter of the mountains. Born and raised in West Virginia, I straddle the culture of my parents and the culture of my Appalachian birthplace. Autumn elicits nostalgia not just for Navratri, but also for my home state, set aflame in oranges, yellows, and reds. I experience a double loss each fall, missing both the mountains of my childhood and the many mothers who played a role for me in raising me there. In Gujarati, the word for maternal aunt is masi, mother-like. So it was that my mother's chosen sisters, cleaved to because of the familiarity they provided in the most foreign of contexts, became my masis, my mother-likes. As the lone Indian girl in my classes at school, I was surrounded by white girls whose parents allowed them to dress in tight clothing, wear makeup, and put chemicals in their hair. Whether because of my awkward appearance, my brown skin, my yet-to-be-realized sexuality, or some combination of the three, dating was also never an option for me. I knew that I could not be like the girls in my classes, but struggled to build a cohesive identity for myself. So it came to be that my many mothers took the traditional place of aunts and cousins in teaching me how to be a good woman and how to live a righteous life. In the absence of any other role models to help me understand what it meant to be an Indian woman and what it meant to be in a relationship, their definitions are the ones I used to construct my own identity, sometimes in a reflection of their image and sometimes in direct opposition to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Neema. That was absolutely beautiful. I've heard that before and I could hear it forevermore. Just beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. And E.B., I'm going to now hand you the stage and have you tell us about Good Grief. But by the way, I'm going to hold up both books. And I hope that you appreciate that I tried to match your book covers with my outfit. So go ahead, E.B.
Thank you, Marjan. And thank you again to the Cary Library. As Marjan said in my bio, it's a very special place to me. So it's thrilling to be here as an author and love being here with Neema. So Good Grief is, it's interesting. I call it a work of narrative nonfiction because I feel like it's kind of the most general description because it's sort of an unusual memoir in that it is what I call a hybrid memoir. It's memoir mixed with research and reporting, which is a type of nonfiction book I personally really love to read. I love reading really well-researched, reported texts, but part of me always really wants to know why the author is as obsessed with the thing they're writing about that they are. And so I really appreciate it in a book where the author just kind of comes clean and says, hey, I'm obsessed with learning about pet death rituals because I had a ton of pets as a kid and they all kept dying. So that's sort of how this book came about. I was, in my MFA program and writing a lot about my family and my human family members. And I found sometimes I was also drawn to writing about my non-human family members growing up. And, when you write about pets, often those stories end with those pets dying, because if you've had a pet, you know that they don't really live as long as people. Tortoises and parrots are the rare exception. So a friend of mine was, kind of just threw this idea out there where she's like, oh, it could be kind of interesting to see how people in different cultures or different places or throughout history have mourned their pets, because there's not really one standardized, socially acceptable way to mourn an animal. Some people think it's inappropriate to do anything at all. Other cultures have full on, funeral processions or cemeteries for animals. And so I started to do some research and I just fell into this black hole. And I really loved getting to kind of weave my personal pet loss stories with all this incredible information I was learning through my research, to kind of tie these things together. And the way I think about it in some ways is this book is like an encyclopedia of options of things to do when your pet dies, which is honestly a book that I wish I had had as a kid, because I feel like when you're grieving an animal and you've maybe never seen anyone else grieve a pet before, it's hard to know what to do. So I just thought I'd read a little bit from the very beginning of chapter 1, which sort of sets up the kind of kid I was and some of the animals that I would have later. And yeah, here it is. So chapter 1 is called Fish and Fossils. Even before I had pets of my own, I loved animals. A sort of only child with 3 half-siblings, a decade my senior, in a mostly childless neighborhood, I spent a lot of time by myself. I sculpted dragons out of Fimo clay. I worked on my novel about an elf named Norman, and I practiced Irish folk songs on the violin. I read a lot of books. I had imaginary friends. I spent hours wandering in the woods surrounding my house in Lexington, Massachusetts. I never got chicken pox. And while I grew to enjoy and cherish being alone, I still got lonely. So I turned to animals for companionship. My first pets were classroom pets at the Lexington Montessori School, which I attended from preschool through 3rd grade. There were hamsters, rabbits, parakeets, fish, 2 turtles named Sam and Ella, a pun that went over my head until I learned more about bacteria, a tarantula, and a pair of giant iguanas whose habitat spanned a quarter of one of the classrooms. Where are we sending her to school? My mom asked my dad after seeing the iguanas. The jungle? Dad shrugged. He thought iguanas were cool. My dad had always loved animals. As a kid, he'd been a regular visitor to the nature center in his New Jersey hometown, where he requested to hold and pet the tarantulas there. My mom, however, was a different story. I was born to a woman violently allergic to dust, mold, pollen, and anything with fur, feathers, or hair. Sure, she could be charmed by someone else's puppy, but only if she'd taken 10 to 20 Sudafed beforehand. Whenever I would return home from playing with one of my aunt's dogs, Mom would either order me to remove all of my dog-haired clothes in the front hallway and sprint to my room to put on clean garments, or make me stand very still with my arms in a T while she pat me down with long strips of Scotch tape. Her first sticky lint roller was a game changer. I was annoyed by the process, but if this was the price I had to pay to roll around in the yard with my aunt's golden retriever Jelly Bean, it was worth it. Because I felt comforted around pets. I felt calmer. I didn't worry about being awkward or saying something weird like I did around other kids. Animals just accepted me as I was. With pets, I could be alone without being lonely. And so, of course, I wanted animals around me at all times. I was desperate to have a pet of my own. I was determined to find a way around my mom's allergies. I read every pet care book in the school library. I wrote persuasive letters. I casually left the D volume of our encyclopedia open on the kitchen table to the page with all of the dog breeds. But here's the thing. Mom wasn't actually resistant to me getting a pet because of her allergies. There are plenty of animals out there that don't make her sneeze. Fish, reptiles. Her allergies were a convenient excuse. Years later, she would tell me that she stalled and evaded my pleas for an animal because she was worried about what would come next. As happy as having an alive pet would make me, she feared how sad I'd become when that pet inevitably died. Of course, though, as a kid, I didn't know that and wouldn't have understood even if I had. I just thought my mom was standing between me and one thing that would make my life complete. I'll stop there.
Lovely. Thank you so much, E.B. It's amazing to have you both read from your books these passages that perfectly capture you, the author, as a person, and also you both were able to capture the theme of your books. I love what you said, E.B., about the hybrid memoir, because I've read a few of those, and it's always fascinating. I love how you phrased it, to read about a topic where, you know, someone else is obsessed about the thing. And because I always used to think of it in the reverse, as this is about, for example, Michael Blanding, when he wrote North by Shakespeare, this is about Shakespeare, and it just so happens that he's in it, but it's the opposite. It's like his obsession speared the memoir, the book. So I want to get to that first question, because I know a lot of people are listening and they're wondering, how do you take all the massive experiences that you've had in your life? How do you take everything that, you know, you want to write about, all the memories you have, and focus so that you have a book that is structured well and that reads well. How did the two of you each come up with this theme? I think, E.B., you touched upon it, but I'm going to go to you. It sounds like you started knowing what you were going to focus on and took it from there.
Yeah, in some ways I feel like I had it sort of easy thinking about what memories to include, because when I started to write about the animals because animals were such a big part of my life. But then once I started doing the research into the pet loss rituals, I was like, okay, I would like to focus on just the memories in my life that involve pets, and specifically that involve grieving pets, or maybe grief in general. Because I touch on like losing my dad's dad, my paternal grandfather, because that was another early grief that I experienced, and sort of like how all these things tie together. So in coming up with the memories, like I created all these sort of like really elaborate timelines for my own life, where I would try to like write down all the pets I remembered having. And then I had these Post-it notes and index cards where I would kind of try to remember, like, okay, I had that bird at the same time as this dog, and like this dog died, and then we got, like this kind of stuff. And that kind of helped me sort the different events. But then I also kind of made different cards and Post-its for the memories that really, are things that I still think about, like those moments, right? Because, if you have a dog for 13 years, like you're not going to write about every single day that you had with the dog, but like what are those things that really jump out and made that experience worthwhile? So I kind of felt like I had an easy way of going through memories, where I was just like, was a pet involved? No? Okay, maybe it's not in this book.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Neema, how about you?
So for me, I think that part of what I had to do was like actually map the place that I grew up, and the first essay in the collection is actually directions to that place. Largely because that place has changed very radically since I grew up there. Appalachia has been hit very hard by climate change, income inequality, substance use disorder, like name the struggle that we are having in this country, and Appalachia is really at the crux of it. And so I kind of had to first like render the place that I grew up in, because it has changed so much. And then it was really just a matter of like letting myself think about like who were the people and what were the experiences in that place that felt like most resonant and rich for me. I just wrote into that. E.B. is very methodical, which I really admire, and I am not. I'm a very intuitive writer. Like I just kind of like go in the direction that, like this Navratri essay that I read from. I woke up one morning during Navratri 6 years ago and was like, I want to write about this, and I'm just going to write about it. And so for me, then it was like when I had what I thought was a collection, I had to go back and think about like, does this hold everything? Like, does it hold all the pieces? Does it represent all the relationships that were important to me? And it by and large did, except that there was like one person who was missing, who was really, really, really important to me. And I kind of was like, how did I write this whole collection and leave this person out? And so then I ended up writing actually a piece that was a sketch specifically about that person. And it's the last essay that I wrote, and I wrote it because it was like a gap that I recognized when I put it all together. But very different approaches, I think, that end up, you kind of get to the same place, but in different ways.
Absolutely. And actually that speaks to a question that Kathleen has posed. She had asked about whether you guys begin with brainstorming or meditating, and how you go about expanding the story. And we will get to chronology, which she also asks about in a minute. But first, I was curious about what you just said, Neema. You were capturing so much, and then you remembered this one person that you had sort of left out. And that's what I was thinking about the whole time I was reading both of your books. I was astonished by the detail, by just the way you recreated so many bits and pieces of your childhood. So I'm curious whether you relied entirely on memory, or whether you are diary keepers. Did you keep a journal? How did you go back in time? Because I think members of our audience are hoping to understand how they can basically capture their own childhoods. E.B., go first.
Sure. Well, as you know, Neema pointed out, I'm very methodical, and so it's probably not a surprise that I have been like a obsessive record keeper my whole life. I started writing in journals every day in August 2001, so I have tons of journals from that era on, but even before that, I was always drawing pictures of animals I had. I had other little journals and diaries. There's a diary from when I was in first through third grade where I have an entry specifically about how I was so honored to get to be the one who put the classroom hamster in the hole that my teacher dug when Cinnamon died. So I had a lot of material to draw from. And I also, relied on my own memory as best I could, but I also just constantly harassed my family members. I just feel like, my parents would get a phone call from me and I'd be like, "Do you have a few minutes?" And they'd be like, "Uh-oh, like what's she gonna ask now?" And I'd be like, "Okay, so Clara the parakeet, like where did we live when I had her?" So I did a lot of fact checking, I guess, within my family. And also actually going off the question about how to begin writing in a way. I'm a very visual person too. I also studied studio art and photography. And so photos are always a really, really big thing for me. So sometimes, especially when I'm feeling writer's block and not sure where to start, like I'll just like pour through old photo album books of, photos of me with my dogs and just like try to describe like, oh, I remember wearing that sweater and holding this dog. And like that image will jar something and stir something up that maybe I couldn't have just pulled from my memory. So photos are really, really helpful. Yeah. Neema, do you use photos too?
Yeah, I am not a diary keeper, or like I do have diaries from when I was younger, but they're full of nonsense. So I try not to read them. But photographs for me were like really rich source material because they're so effective, just like putting you right back in that moment, right? And then it's almost like that unlocks so much sensory stuff. The image unlocks a lot. But in the same way, I think for me, music is actually really helpful. So like listening to the hymns that my mom used to sing me, or that they used to sing at the pujas, or listening to the Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton that my mom used to listen to, or right, like those things I can use to tap into memory also. Food also is another one for me. So I think one thing that probably all writers of memoir have in common is that they were pretty observant children. Like I think you don't grow up to write memoir if you weren't somebody who was like really attuned to noticing the world. And so I think then if you were that kind of noticer, then like one sensory cue can really open up like a whole channel of memory for you. And so I found that to be really helpful for me. The other thing that's the case is a lot of the things I wrote about, I did many times. Like if there's a ritual, I did that ritual every year for so many years, right? So it's like you have this accumulation of memory that's layered on layered on layer that you're able to tap into. It's not like I'm trying to remember something that happened once. I'm remembering something that happened 9 times every Navratri for my entire childhood. So I have a lot that I can go to there.
I love that. Oh, that what you both said really rings true. The photographs, I think that's such a great tip for our budding memoirists to sort of just excavate those old photo albums, look at them, it sparks the memories. I love what you said about food and the music. And E.B., like you, I'm a diary keeper. So I have an embarrassingly long collection of journals that I can go to and sort of mine. But I was curious, as you did this kind of memory mining, I know you both in tandem were doing research, basically factual research. I mean, E.B., you have a ton of research in your book about the ways different cultures grieve for the loss of their pets, how we memorialize our pets as humans. And Neema, you include research too about the immigration history to West Virginia, and political history. And I was wondering if you could talk about the research you did outside of mining your personal material, outside of journals and photos, and you know, the music that was personal to you. And it leads into a question Amanda had in the chat. Hi, Amanda. She was asking what, you know, whether there were certain childhood books that you went back to that informed your work. So I will go to E.B. again.
Sure. Well, first with childhood books, totally. As part of my research, I reread a lot of classic, middle grade children's literature that I had loved, because part of me was like, oh, is Charlotte's Web as devastating as I remember it being? And let me tell you, it is. I just remember at one point I was like finishing like rereading Where the Red Fern Grows, like on the beach crying, and I was like, why am I doing this to myself? But I cast a really wide net when I started doing the research, because I wasn't really sure. I had no idea what the structure of the book was going to be when I started doing research. So I was just sort of like taking in as much random pet death related material as I could and kind of seeing what drew me in. And there are a lot of nonfiction writers who, I feel like everyone has often very strong feelings about how they approach research. So like Susan Orlean is a writer I really admire, and she's very much like, I like to do all my research up front before I write any words. She's like, I want to know I've read every single book I want to read and found every document, and then I sit down and write. And I'm more like, I like to go back and forth, because I feel like sometimes I get so overloaded with cool facts and quotes and stories and stuff. I need time to write it and about it and process it and mull it over. And then also I'll notice holes in my research once I start to write about it. So one example is I interviewed a bunch of vets for the book, veterinarians, not veterans, though I did actually interview a veteran too about his service dog. But the veterinarians, I often found people to interview for this book who are friends of friends or people I knew, or like, I would interview someone and they would connect me with other people they knew. And so anyway, I was writing the veterinarian chapter and I noticed, oh, all the people I talked to have been vets for 10 years or less. And I was like, I need to talk to somebody who's been a veterinarian for like 40 plus years. So I felt like those are things I often only really noticed once I started to write. And then I would be like, okay, I'm going to pause the writing. I'm going to go out and find some like long-term veterinarians and see what that experience is like. And then I'll return to it. So I really like to go back and forth. And as the structure of the book started to come together, where I kind of chose a different theme or element of pet death rituals to kind of structure each chapter. Each chapter is almost like an essay in a way. That then helped too when I realized, okay, this is the chapter that's about objects people make to memorialize their pets, both like art pieces or crafts or taxidermy or even cloning your pet. And then that helped me shape often to see where I had holes in my research. So I like to move back and forth with those things.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So doing the research and the writing in tandem. How about you, Neema? Curious about your research process for this.
I feel so much more haphazard than E.B. Listening to her is good. It's good for me to listen to. I think for me, research was often like to fill in or answer questions that like the writing raised that I didn't have the answers to. So, for example, there's one essay in my collection called Chemical Bonds that is about my relationship to work and my dad's relationship to his work and how they're different from each other because of the fact that he was an immigrant and I'm the child of immigrants. And we have the ability to take different levels of risk because of our status in society. I wrote that essay and my dad is not somebody who likes to talk a lot about his experiences. He had some really challenging experiences at work. It's not a thing he likes to dwell on or talk about. So trying to figure out how to have his voice in the piece was a real challenge. And the lucky thing for me is that my dad used to be a very prolific op-ed writer, which is funny because I also like to write op-eds and didn't really realize necessarily where that came from until I started to work on this essay. And then I went back to read my dad's op-eds where he talks a lot about the chemical industry in West Virginia. And so it was my desire to incorporate his voice that sent me into the research, right? For me, often it was that. It was like, there's a hole or a gap in this story. There's a voice that's not included here. There's history that people don't have, so they're not going to understand this context. And then it was going to find the information that was going to fill in that gap.
Beautiful, beautiful. So the way that, doing the research, writing it, it almost feeds on itself. And I think that's a really important thing for our listeners to realize, that it's not like you need to know everything when you start. Once you start, the book begins to form within your hands, and it's sort of like one thing leads to another. So I love how you both have sort of opened that up so that our audience members know that it's almost like it begets itself, like this research begets this chapter, which begets that. And I see questions in the chat. I promise I will get to them. But one thing you said to me, Neema, it feeds into a question I had, which is the question of, what do we do about the people we love reading our memoirs when they are in them? Both of you talk about your parents. Neema, you just mentioned that example. I love that quote. I am indebted, I am implicated. You write it when it comes to your father's role in defending the chemical industry, but you also write about the distance between your experiences, you as a natural born citizen, sort of chafing against systemic racism, and your father, who was a first generation immigrant, really trying to fit into this white dominated culture. And E.B., you mentioned, I mean, from the get-go, you had to convince your mom, and we see your dad, we see your grandfather grapple with an incredible, difficult situation. You describe it as, the hardest thing he ever had to do. And here it is in your book. So I know this is what a lot of people are worried about. How do I portray these people I love without hurting them, or what are they going to think? Can you guys talk to that? And Neema, I'll have you go first, because I don't want to always like do the same order. So how did you sort of reconcile that?
Yeah, I think that is one of the hardest things about writing memoir. And culturally, for me, it was super hard because it is not typical for Desi women to have an opinion, write it down, publish it. Like, those are all taking steps pretty far away from what's like culturally expected. And I knew that. But I also felt like there were stories that were really important to tell, that were bigger than just my experience, and that connected to other Desi people, to other queer kids, to other Appalachian people. Like, that there was too much resonance to kind of let the cultural expectation create silence. And so the approach I took was to write about people with as much care and empathy as I could, and to think about the fact that if I was going to write about anybody else, I had to implicate myself 10 times for any one time I asked a question about them. So their purpose in the story has to be to sort of like push me to question myself, and to sort of think really hard about my role in any situation where I'm raising sort of like their experience and holding it under a microscope. Like, it can't be that their experience is under a microscope and mine never is. It's like, if theirs is once, mine needs to be a whole bunch of times. That's complicated. Like, I think I remember taking a class with an instructor at Grub Street where he made us read this essay. It's called Please Have the Conversation. And it was an editor at Fourth Genre sort of talking about how they wanted this writer to have a conversation with the person that they wrote their essay about. And I appreciate that idea, but I think it ignores the fact that power is a very real thing, and that for people who come from cultures that are historically deeply patriarchal, there's not a conversation, there's just silence. And
Yeah,
so
I can relate to that. Yeah.
right. So it's like, if I have to have a conversation, I will never write anything, because it won't be a conversation. It will be no. And then then it's done. Because if you said no, I can't go against your no. Right.
Yeah.
And so that just wasn't a real thing. Like, I couldn't have the conversation. So then I'm left with, like, how do I ethically write this in a way that extends as much care to people as possible, that's not about shame, that's not about blame, but is about seeking to understand why we do the things we do. And that is the way I approached it.
Wonderfully put. Wonderfully put. EB, what's your opinion on this, navigating this?
My advice, what I often say when I'm teaching memoir classes, because this is like, I feel like students always number one question, is as best you can in first drafts, write whatever you need to write and get it down and pretend no one will ever see it. My friend Megan wrote a memoir and she said, like, I just had to imagine I was like in a locked vault under the ocean and no one would ever see what I was writing. But then as you revise, I mean, I do think like Neema said, there's also power, like a power dynamic as a writer. Like you get to kind of control the narrative of your family, and that's like the record. And people read my book and come up to my parents and like think they like know my parents, and they just know this one part of my parents that I have put on the page. Or these few specific things about my grandfather. So, I mean, I think being mindful of the power imbalance is really important as well. Like I have this platform, I have this control, and other people are like pawns in my narrative. And so, I mean, I think it really depends on your relationship with the people you are writing about, and there's no one size fits all. So, like, I'm very close to my grandfather and my parents, and Richie, who's now my husband, though a lot of what I was writing about in the book was when we were still dating or engaged. And I let all of them read the parts where they show up before the book came out. And I said, does this feel factually accurate? Do you think this is fair? Are you comfortable with this being out in the world? Like the thing that Marjan alluded to with my grandfather, like was a really hard decision he had to make. And I was like, are you comfortable with people reading about this? And he said, if you think it will help people, pal, like I'm fine with you including it. But we had a conversation. But then I know other people, who are writing stuff and they are estranged from their family, or they don't have a relationship like that. Or like Neema said, if they say no, then I feel like I can't write it anymore. So I think, and often within a family too, you could have a great relationship with your mom and show your mom all your drafts and not be able to show your dad anything. So like, it really varies. And I think you have to kind of weigh each relationship and think about, what could possibly come of this, if this is out in the world. And I think that's a very real thing that you have to think about. And honestly, everyone's always worried about getting sued. And I think it's less about getting sued and more just about like Christmas is going to be really awkward.
Yeah. I think you both touched upon so many aspects of this issue, and thank you for those nuanced thoughts. I appreciate it. I think it's helpful to keep in mind, all the very different things you have to consider. Which brings me to my next question about the emotional intensity of writing about these things. And, E.B., you're writing literally about death. But I love that quote you included about a certain culture that believes you don't have a good life unless you think about death 6 times a day. So you really explore this issue, grief, and Neema, you go back to all these ways systemic racism was just steeped in that region and in the way you grew up. My question is the same as a question an attendee had, which is, was there a therapeutic nature to all of this? Did you get a sense of healing by writing these books? Neema.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. Right. Like I'm a queer Desi Appalachian person. There are no mirrors for me except the one I made in writing this book. So like there's the only vessel in the world that contains all of me is the one I created. That's like kind of a powerful thing to think about, right? That like it didn't exist, I had to make it, but now I made it, now it's here. And now if there's like anybody else who comes after me, like they have this too, right? So there's some intergenerational healing that becomes possible because this exists. I think the other thing that was so powerful or has been so powerful is readers' responses to the book, right? Which is like when I feel like when people recognize their questions in your book, when they see their struggles reflected, when they see that like we share some core struggles that we're trying to make sense of, There's a kind of connection and relationship that gets built that I didn't really anticipate. Like I didn't think that hard about that part, and yet it's been like one of the most powerful parts is knowing that like you can actually mapping your own questions out on the page can create a mirror for someone else, and can bind you to each other because you share the same questions. So there is really a lot of power, I think, in telling the story, for sure.
I love that. So healing and actually writing it, and healing in the way it lives on because of the messages and comments and letters you get from readers. It's sort of this continued healing in a way, to know that you gave them the mirror that you didn't have. E.B., tell us about this aspect. If it felt healing to write it, and now that it's out, how that feels.
Yeah, well, it's funny, you bring up the emotional intensity, and it's a book about pets dying. So like you'd think it'd be very emotional. And what's funny is the first draft I turned in to my editor, it was actually almost twice as long as the book actually is now. It was like 120,000 words. It's now like 65,000, I think. And I turned it in, and Neema, you keep saying I'm so thorough, and my editor actually, she called me completist at one time, which she meant, I don't think as a compliment, because she was like, you have this checklist, you've gone through every animal you've had, you've included all these quotes, all these facts. And she very nicely said, E.B., I don't know how you feel about any of this. And I was like, what are you talking about? I wrote 120,000 words about pets dying. And she's like, but I don't understand why it was so hard for you, and why it was so upsetting, and like why you were drawn to write about this. And I was like, oh, I was avoiding that. Like I didn't want to have to write about that, because that's the really hard part. And so then I went back and I like gutted the draft. I cut like, 50% of all these different things I was quoting and all these sources. And I had to really dig in and write about the stuff that obviously I had been putting off because I knew it was going to be sad and hard. In the book, the final structure, it's organized by type of pet like that I had. So the first chapter is like fish, and the second chapter is birds. And the final chapter is about dogs. And I put off writing about my childhood dogs like until like I really had to turn that revision in, because it was the hardest part, because those were the pets I had the longest. Those were pets that had seen me through basically like middle school through grad school. And I just kept putting it off. But once I finally kind of sat there and actually like let myself cry about like, it was so shocking when my dog was euthanized, when the first time I experienced that, I didn't know what to expect. I felt like crap while I was writing it, but then afterwards I did feel better to have it out and on the page. And since the book has been published, like I have gotten really kind messages from people who say all kinds of things like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one who had to miss work or school because I was so sad about my pet dying, or you really captured how I felt when I had to bring my animal to the vet for the last time. And people who felt pretty alone, because I mentioned in the book too, mourning pets is a disenfranchised grief, which it's a type of grief we don't talk about very openly. And so, I wanted this book to be a place where people could look and see, mirrors of their own pet loss experiences read back. And so it my first draft was just all facts, and then I had to go back and like really put the feelings in there, but I'm really glad I did in the end. I feel like I've connected with a lot of people over it.
Yeah, they're definitely there now, definitely. And it's very moving, and you both touch on community so much. And I love that, there's a catharsis you mentioned in writing the book, a catharsis in having people react to the book, this kind of continual healing that goes on. So I have so many more questions for both of you, but I don't want to be selfish, even though I really do. I'm going to ask one last one, then we're going to get to the audience questions. But my last question is, I know that you both value mentorship. You're both teachers, you both teach. And maybe just as our little plot twist, you could reveal to the audience your own professional relationship, which I think they might be tickled to hear about. So Neema, do you want to share a little bit about that relationship that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So E.B. was my instructor for multiple classes at Crum Street. I was teaching middle school full time when I was writing this book, which meant the only way I really wrote was by taking classes that forced me to have deadlines, and to be in community with people who could kind of like keep pushing me along. And when I got to the point where I thought I had a collection, I didn't really know what to do with it. And E.B. was actually the person who shared with me how to write, like how to create a book proposal, how to sort of like think about this whole process. And I often say, like, I wouldn't even known how to start this process without her. There wouldn't really be in Another Appalachia in the form that it exists if it hadn't been for her support.
Beautiful.
I know, I feel really lucky that I got to read like all of these essays, like, you know, so many versions along the way. But in a plot twist, what's funny is like when Neema was getting ready to, you know, kind of send her book out into the world, and I shared my proposal and query letters and stuff with her, I had actually already sold my book, but I had sold it based on just the proposal. So I was still actively writing it. So actually Neema's book ended up coming out before mine did. And so then we sort of switched roles, and Neema became my mentor, because I was like, oh my gosh, what is it like to do a launch party, or how do you feel today? Or, you know, and just Neema was a really great guide to kind of, you know, it was about 6 months ahead of my book to kind of be like, okay, this is what you're in store for. Make sure you drink water, make sure you get sleep, you know, these important things. So I always really love, I feel like in the literary community, especially in Boston, there's like a lot of this sort of back and forth. And just because someone was your teacher once, then you could totally switch roles later. And I think it's very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. We're so lucky in the Boston area to have this supportive community. All right, well, I promised I'd get to the audience questions. One of them we already answered about the therapeutic nature. But there's another question about, somebody says, recently I heard an agent remark about memoir being the hardest genre to break into in terms of getting published, unless you've had, in quotes, a very interesting life and can write about it beautifully. What do you guys think about that assessment?
I think even if you have those things, it can be a really hard genre to break into, because I think I've had an interesting life, and I think I write okay, and I had a really hard time getting my book published. I think that the genre of memoir has really turned to like celebrity memoir in a lot of ways. And so people, like the big publishing houses, like are looking for things that can sell on that scale. And so it's not just an interesting life, it kind of has to be like a sensational life sometimes to sort of sell in that space. But I also think it's important for people to recognize that like publishing can look a lot of different ways. So there is that very traditional path, which is like getting an agent, you know, going to the big 5 houses. But there are also like incredible small presses and university presses that publish much more experimental work, much more intersectional work in a lot of cases, and do that, and they do it on a lower budget, you know, and there's not a big fancy advance that comes with it, but there are spaces, I think, that are interested in our stories. It just may not be at HarperCollins necessarily. It might be. E.B. was, but like, you know, so was J.D. Vance. So, you know, you get like both of those things. It is more, I think, about adjusting. For me, it was about adjusting my expectations or my understanding of what publishing possibilities existed, rather than continuing to kind of go down a road where I was getting the message that like, this is beautiful, but we don't know how to sell it. I needed to think about who could sell it.
I think, well, actually, I wasn't even supposed to be at HarperCollins. I only ended up at HarperCollins because my contract was with HMH Books and Media, and they got bought by HarperCollins during COVID. But yeah, they're totally, you know, pros and cons to different publishing house sizes and different routes. And like, you know, I was at a big 5, but I was a nobody at a big 5, right? And you know, these big publishing houses, like they want a book like Spare because they know everyone's going to buy Prince Harry's face on the cover of that book. And like, you know, that can be really frustrating, because even if you get to the point where your book is out, then it's like, well, they're not sinking money into marketing it because they're like, well, whatever, we can kind of eat the cost of her advance because it's nothing compared to whatever, $1 billion that Prince Harry got. But yeah, so selling memoir is really hard. And I don't want my students to ever get discouraged, to feel like they can't. And something I recommend a lot is sort of what I did for my book, right? Like, who am I? I'm like just a random person who's had a lot of pets. But I was able to do all this research and bring in all these other experts and all these other voices and tie my personal story to this reporting and this research. And I feel like a lot of people I'm seeing have success sell memoirs are often doing that now, where it's like, it's not just my life story, it's my life story clearly commenting on some aspect of culture or society or history or whatever it is. And like Neema's book does that too, right? Through these personal essays. So I think that can be a way that if you're getting like a lot of pushback from agents saying like, well, your life seems kind of interesting, but like nobody cares who you are. Like a way to kind of work around that can be to find a way to anchor it into something more like newsy or historical or anthropological, that's bigger than your own story.
Very good point. Yeah. Which you both did do very effectively, sort of weaved it in. All right, we have a question. How important was it to portray your authentic self to the world versus what you want to portray? The question comes from what I see as a very performance-based society.
I mean, I'll start by saying I think Neema already nailed it, that like you have to implicate yourself as well if you're writing memoir. Like the most boring memoirs I've ever read are ones where somehow the author has never done anything wrong in their whole life. And you're like, wow, that's amazing. All these people wronged you, but you're a perfect angel and you just don't believe it, right? And so I think like for me, similarly, like, I was sharing stories about ways people like screwed up care for their pets and their pets got sick or died as a consequence. And so I was like, I have to put in stories where I was not a perfect pet owner either. And, I have to put in stuff where I misstep, or I say things I shouldn't have, or I didn't understand something at the time that I would learn later. And I think basically like making yourself look bad is a way to really like make your authentic self more visible on the page.
Yes, I remember the hamster, E.B.
Yeah.
I
Oh man,
forgave you, but that was a very,
it was bad. It was brutal. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's happened to all of us though in some way. Neema, what do you say to that? You sort of address it, but go ahead.
No, I mean, I just think it is so important. I think we are living in a very performative time. But I think that actually makes it really hard for people to be vulnerable and really hard for people to make connections, because there's this expectation of perfection that is sort of like externally required. And so I think that actually makes it even more important that as writers, we are vulnerable and we are honest about our missteps and honest about our struggles and our questions, because that's one of the few spaces that I feel like people have anymore to like see the fullness of humanity and to see that like all of us are messy and complicated and make mistakes and screw up and have to go back and fix it. I mean, like, we're not perfect. And I think that expectation of perfection makes it very, very difficult for us to build real relationships with one another. So to me, like the requirement to write with authenticity and honesty is even higher now than it might have been at another point, because there is so much space where people aren't doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like an antidote to the social media structure that we're all struggling in. All right. Well, I feel like we could go on, and I actually do have a lot more questions for you both, but I'm gonna save them for when I see you in person. And I want to thank both of you for sharing these beautiful stories with us, for doing it so effectively, so honestly. These books are, I feel like they're more than memoirs. They're just like little worlds into themselves. So I hope that our listeners are inspired by how you went about creating these books. And to the people tuning in, thank you for tuning in. I'm competing with the president tonight, so thank you for being here. And I hope that our writers have inspired you to get out your old photos, get out your old CDs if you still have them, get out those old songs, and start coming up with a theme or an angle for your own memoir. I feel like it's an incredible gift that you can give to the world. Thank you, E.B. Thank you, Neema. Thank you both for sharing this time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on behalf of the Cary Memorial Library and the Cary Library Foundation, I wish you all happy reading, happy writing, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Good night.
Oh, wait.